Hey everyone, and welcome to a special series of my podcast, Rethinking with Alex Torpy. So I wanted to do a couple episodes specifically related to some thoughts on public information engagement and technology in local government. And the timing of this is that I'm just wrapping up a project with Sustainable Jersey. Those of you in New Jersey will be very familiar with Sustainable Jersey. Really great organization that started out helping incentivize municipalities and local governments to adopt more green practices and has really broadened their scope to touch all sorts of important areas in local government. The program that we just are finishing wrapping up was the 2020 Public Information and Engagement Technology Assessment. So I was brought in as a consultant to manage and implement that program. We worked with 4 municipalities. A number of towns applied to Sustainable Jersey for a grant, and the grant was the technical assistance from myself to help them do this technology assessment and figure out how to support some of the policies and programs that they were working on themselves. So we worked with 4 towns, Hope Township, Gloucester City, Freehold Borough, and Runnymede Borough. Really amazing getting to know some of the people in each of those communities. And actually with Sustainable Jersey, we're putting out sort of a top 10 lessons learned, some kind of specific best practices about public information and engagement and using technology in that regard. That will be linked on Sustainable Jersey's website. I'll probably link to it as well. But what I wanted to cover in this quick video and a couple others that I'm going to do in this series are sort of more conceptual lessons from that program and from that experience. So, those of you who have been who've been connected to me for a while, you'll know that this is an area that's really important to me and was a big part of why I ran for office in South Orange in 2011. And so what I thought when I was running for office was, what I believed, and this came from my practical experience, although some people would question that, in student government in college, and also the sort of academic studies and a little bit of professional exposure that I had when I was 23 and began to run, that getting more people into government and broadening the scope of where governments solicited feedback from would make a really big difference in doing better programs and policy. Because, we've all heard this term, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I don't believe in that. I believe it exists, but it is a problem. The squeaky wheels should not get the grease. You should give the wheels grease based on a proactive and strategic assessment of what wheels need grease, not based on which wheel is, yelling at you the loudest. But that's not how most governments work, and we see that national level, state level, and local level. And so when I ran, one of the things that I had noted in South Orange was that the people who were really participating were a really small group of people and not really representative of the larger community. Part of my platform was to try and expand that, something we did very successfully in South Orange. But I was sort of right and sort of wrong with what I believed at the time. This is now almost 10 years ago, which is a little frightening to think about, and I'd rather move on so I don't wallow on that fact for too long. But what I sort of believed, and I think I said something like this in one of my videos when I was running for office, was the best governing is done with the most number of people involved. Now that is true in some senses, but not true in other senses. I think what we've seen in the United States over the last couple decades is this movement towards democratization of all of these different areas, but without really thinking about what that means and how to set it up for success. You're going to have a very different conversation if you put 1,000 people in a room, who have masks on so you can't see their identity, and what they say with no structure, and just say, what does everybody think about things, versus if you have a framework for how you're soliciting input, making sure you're getting input from different demographic groups so that it's actually representative and the loudest people don't overtake everybody else. There's all sorts of things that need to be done to make sure that what who you're listening to or who you're engaging with, that it's representative of the community and that it's being done in a productive fashion, not just a democratic fashion. So going into all of this, 10 years ago, it's like, all right, we just need to, break down the walls and get everybody involved who could possibly be involved. And what I've learned since then is that you need to structure that the right way. You need to make sure you're proactively reaching out to certain communities to make sure they are involved, especially the communities that may not volunteer to get involved necessarily. And there are especially marginalized communities that don't feel as comfortable interacting with big government systems as other people do. And it's our job in government to make sure that we are getting those people, that we are reaching out to them and bringing them into the process. And so there's all of these things that you can do to sort of maximize your ability to productively get people involved. And what I've seen, especially in the last 2 towns that I've worked in as a business administrator, is that really matters. You can't just say that you want to get people involved. You have to actually follow through in all of these different areas to make sure that it works the right way, and it's working towards your goals. And so one of my reflections here is that one of the things that I see a lot of people do in government is they see technology as a solution. And they see a problem, and then they see a technology platform, some tools, some software, an app, a new website as the solution. But really, and this is the first sort of reflection that I'm going to share in this video, and then I'm going to create a couple more where I reflect on some of these other concepts. And again, if you want the specific best practices, I'll link to that in these notes, and it will also likely be available on Sustainable Jersey's website as well. So the first lesson here, the first reflection is technology is not a solution. Technology is a means, not an ends. If you think about technology as an ends, you're sort of conflating, other than some specific use cases where there is a technology problem that you're solving with a technology solution. And so most of the time what people end up doing is they think about technology as an ends, and you say, okay, well, we need to get the public more engaged, so we're going to create a website. We need to communicate about what's going on, so we're going to start an email list. Well, those things might be tactics or tools that you use, but they are not the solutions themselves. Right? If you want to get your community more informed and engaged, you need to build out an information and engagement plan. And that plan needs to include bringing in stakeholders. So if you're in local government, for example, that might take the form of an advisory committee to your governing body, where you have 1 or 2 staff people on it, where you might have 1 or 2 elected officials on it. You might have some residents on it. You might have a business owner or 2 on it. You might have people, if you have specific industries or sectors represented in your community, you might have people from, so if, like, for example, if you have a university, you might have someone specific from the university, and create a group of people that is going to assist the municipality in actually implementing this public information engagement plan. And in the course of working towards that vision, you may do things like create a new website or start an email newsletter or something like that. But those things are means to an end. And that makes a really big difference, because if you mix up the ends and means, you're going to be measuring the wrong outcomes, right? And you won't actually know if or when you were successful. So an example might be starting an email newsletter, right? And if you want to use that as a way to communicate to people in your community, but you see the email newsletter as the solution itself, then you might do things like measure how many people are signed up for your email newsletter list, or how many emails you send out. Or you might just start sending out an email once a month and sort of say, okay, we've crossed this off. But that's not enough. That's incomplete data, because you're not really measuring the right thing. If the purpose is communicating to your community, what is the purpose of communicating to your community? Right? Each time you think about sort of a solution, something that you're implementing, try and take it to that next step. So, okay, we're launching an email newsletter. Why do we want to do that? Well, because we want to tell people in the community about things that are going on. Well, why do we want to do that? Well, because we think that people don't know as much about what's going on as we think they should. 2 things. How do we know that's the case? And the second thing is, how will we know that people are better informed? What are we using to to understand how well informed or educated a community might be on an issue. And that's really important because you're not communicating, you're not sending emails into the ether, right? If you're in local government and you're trying to move forward on, let's say, an important redevelopment project that is going to help meet your affordable housing needs, maybe generate some revenue so that you can lessen any tax increase impact on existing homeowners or business owners, and people in the community aren't on the same page with you about what you're working on. If you go ahead and move forward on that program without figuring out a way to measure the sort of civic literacy or policy literacy of people in your community, you're not going to be measuring the right thing. So you may be sending emails out, but if people aren't A, more informed, and B, engaging in a more productive fashion, then what's the point of sending out those emails in the first place, right? Those emails themselves are a means to an end. And so your end might be that in your council meetings, you feel like people are coming there and they're misinformed about what you're doing, and they're really frustrated about something, but their frustration is actually the same concern that you have, but you're on a different page about, they think that your plan is going to raise taxes, but your plan is actually going to lower taxes, but you're talking about the same plan, right? And so that's something that you should be able to figure out. You should be able to talk about that and get everybody on the same page about what the details of that actually are. And so if an email newsletter is one piece to that, that allows you to sort of build that program out. Because that program you're not going to address that need, right, of, let's say, people in the community not being informed or productively engaged enough in things that you're working on. You're not going to be able to solve that by only sending emails out once a month. You're going to have to do a lot more than that. And I think that's part of the problem of this mindset, is that on a high level, especially, I hate to say, for some elected officials, they think that this is sort of okay, just do it, just send out the emails and then everything is solved. But it's much more complex than that. And it's much harder than that. And so you're not only going to be needing to send out those emails, you're going to need to figure out a way to measure how well informed people are in the community. You're going to need to figure out a way to understand the dynamic of the conversations with your city council and governing body. So if they're getting all sorts of letters from people in the community that are really frustrated about a project, and you start rolling out an email newsletter campaign, let's say you're sending out an email every 2 weeks, in 4 months, you're going to want to measure, well, did the tone and tenor of the kinds of emails the city council receives on a regular basis change? Are we getting more emails or less emails? Are the types of emails different? Are they coming from the same people? Are they coming from the same demographics in the community? Are they about the same issues? And so those kinds of things are really important to flesh out. But if your mindset is that the technology is a solution, you're probably not going to go further into understanding the real nuance of whether what you're doing is actually meeting your goal or not. This is one of the things that we worked with these 4 municipalities on fleshing out, and it's something that I talk about in the classes that I teach in Seton Hall's Master of Public Administration program, and it's a big part of the consulting that I do in all of my work, is making sure everybody understands what their goals actually are. And going through that sort of visioning and goal-setting process is critical to do in the beginning before you even think about discussing any solutions. We're going to do a future episode on that process, which is sort of a macro-level version of what we're talking about here, right, where we're conflating means and ends. Technology is not an ends, again, except in certain use cases. But for the most part, it is just a means. It is a way for you to accomplish another goal. And so if you want your community to be more informed and engaged, it might be because, the prior governing body was, taking on debt at an astronomical rate, and the people in the community didn't understand that was happening. So this, for example, is something that happened in Lambertville, where I most recently worked. For many years, the municipality had been borrowing money. Doing bond ordinances, at least in New Jersey, it doesn't really show up on the state budget document the same way that increases in your operating budget shows up. So especially if you don't have a thorough capital plan in your budget, which most municipalities don't, if you're just doing bond ordinances 10 or 15 times a year, it's pretty hard for people in the community or for the media or even for council members who may not be as savvy to be able to keep up with what's actually happening. Now, that itself is a problem, but if you now come in and you want to resolve that, and you want to say, okay, we've got to scale back the amount of money that we're borrowing in this community because we can't afford it. And you could look at basically every level of government in the United States, and we're borrowing too much and creating too much debt at every level of government. So this is a real practical problem, right? But in this community, so you come in and you want to fix this problem. Your goal here is not just about identifying, creating a debt management plan, figuring out how to finance capital projects in a way so you don't have to borrow as much. It's not just those things, cutting back professional service fees, et cetera, right? It's not just those things. Because if you're going to change the way that you're going about something, and it's going to have ripple effects in other areas of your governing, then you've got to communicate to the community what you're doing, right? You can't just expect people to know what you're doing. You have to be very, very strategic and proactive about going out there and talking about it. And so your first step might be, like, for example, in Lambertville, our first step was communicating to the elected officials about what the problems were because they didn't really know. And then the step after that was supposed to be communicating to the public about what the problems were. And so you're going to need to use technology to accomplish the goal of helping people in the community understand how much money was being borrowed in the past, what the impacts on the municipality of that unsustainable borrowing actually are, and what the possible options or solutions are going forward to correct that, and what that means for other policies. So what that might mean, for example, is that less roads are going to get resurfaced for the next 3 years as you scale back the amount of new debt that you're authorizing, for example. But you don't want to scale back how many roads you're doing until you know that people in the community understand why you're doing that. And the best way, or one of the best ways, to help people understand that is to use technology to communicate and engage with all of those people. But again, that technology in that case is not a solution. It is a way for you to implement another solution, right? The solution in that case is creating better community civic literacy around municipal debt and the future tax impacts on the municipality based on how it borrows. That's the thing that you're doing. You're using technology to accomplish that thing. And by thinking about things that way, you can measure the outcomes of all the different aspects of your programs better, right? You can measure whether the technology tools are helping accomplish the larger goals, whether those larger goals are actually being accomplished or not. It doesn't matter in that case, right? It doesn't matter if you've got 10,000 people who live in your community and you've got 3,000 people on your email list, which would be pretty good, right? It doesn't matter even if that email list has a 50% open rate, if people are showing up at council meetings with the same complaints or the same misunderstandings about the debt situation, for example, then the email program is not actually accomplishing the goal. It isn't addressing the need. And so you can change the email program potentially, right? Maybe you're not including the right information in the program. Maybe there's other people putting out misinformation. Whatever the things are, it will allow you to identify what's actually happening a little bit better. And this is a really relevant example because, certainly my belief, and I think many of the belief of people who are watching this or listening to this, is that you have to get your community on board. I know that for a long time, the sort of ideology has been to leave communities, for many people and many elected officials, to leave communities in the dark. And even many of the ones who claim to want to do transparency, they're actually just being sort of as performative as anybody else. They're talking about transparency, but making all the decisions behind closed doors. If you really want to get these things done, you've got to do it in partnership with your community. Trusted government is at an all-time low, and I think it's our job at the local level especially to rebuild that, because we actually can, especially in some of these smaller towns where you can kind of talk to almost everybody in your community. So the first reflection from today is don't think about technology as a solution. Don't think about technology as an ends. Think about technology as a means to an ends. Some of the topics that I'm going to cover in a couple of the future episodes in this short series, we're going to talk about thinking about process versus outcomes. This is sort of related to this conversation. This is a really important management ideology. We're going to talk about some of the things that different towns all are dealing with, like the same, where you really don't need to reinvent the wheel with some of the challenges that you might have, especially for towns of similar sizes in New Jersey, but also across the country. There are many similar problems. Even if the policy goals are different, the process challenges are often very, very similar. There's a lot more best practices out there than it seems like. Next is that, especially in regards to technology specifically, is figuring out a way to manage and provide support for all of your technology projects is actually a really big challenge. And it's a challenge that a lot of municipalities have. There's not one easy solution, but there are some things that you can do to improve, and a lot of that relates to shared services. But making sure that you have not only the right IT support so that your technology infrastructure has people who can ensure everything is working smoothly, and especially these days ensuring that everything is secure, but making sure you also have somebody who is managing your IT from a high-level policy perspective, which most IT support companies don't do. And it's really critical to have somebody in your administration, not an elected official, but someone in your administration who has project management, budgeting, and IT experience. It might be your administrator, it might be your clerk, it might be an IT person or a communications person, but it's really important to have somebody in that position who is looking at all of the contracts related to technology, making sure the terms are beneficial to the municipality, who is overseeing the implementation of those projects, who's looking for funding for those projects, all those different things. And the last piece is something that I think a lot of municipalities struggle with, which is figuring out a way to finance new technology projects. There are a couple opportunities that are highly underutilized in New Jersey specifically, especially in regards to in regards to grants through the Department of Community Affairs at the state, in thinking through shared service opportunities. So there's actually some pretty underutilized pots of money there that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So this is just kind of an introduction here. It's a special series. This is really focused on the public information engagement in local government. Again, if you want to find some of the specific best practices, for example, about rolling out a 311 system, how to do a website project, how to create a social media or communications policy, check out the other videos that I'm going to be doing here. And if you want to think about, or check out the link to the other video in the description. And if you want to talk a little bit about some of these conceptual pieces, stick around. I'm going to do 3, 4, or 5 more of these. If there's anything that you have questions about, if you're watching this and you want me to talk about anything or address something specifically, shoot me an email, ping me on social media, let me know. And I'll be happy to try and cover it in an upcoming episode. I hope these are helpful. And again, let me know what you think. Good luck with everything that you're working on, and I'll talk to everybody soon. Thank you.